Hello historians, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Prof. J. I am your history professor. And today we're going to finish our look at the French Revolution by looking at the second half of the revolution from roughly 1792 to about 1795 and a little bit beyond that. We're going to pick up from where the first video left off with the civil constitution of the clergy, as well as King Louis XVI's response to it, the king's attempted escape from France, the election of a new legislative body called the Legislative Assembly under the new constitution that we talked about in the previous video, the declaration of war against the Austrians and the radicalism that that war engendered, the election of yet another new legislative body called the National Convention, and the increasing paranoia that we see spreading throughout France, but particularly in Paris, regarding the issue of so-called counter-revolutionaries who were supposedly trying to undo the revolution from within. We'll also take a look at the increasing amounts of violence that the French government was using to deal with those supposed enemies of the state, wars they were fighting against not just foreign powers, but against their own people at home, particularly in Western France, and the stripping of civil liberties that were granted in the earlier phase of the revolution by the Committee of Public Safety and its leader, Maximilien Robespierre. Our video today will culminate with the death of Robespierre, the ascension of the Directory government, leading to the emergence of Napoleon. Without further ado then, it's time for history, so let's go ahead and get started. Hello historians, and welcome to the radical phase of the French Revolution. In the previous presentation, we dove into the liberal phase, discussing the Ancien Régime and the problems it faced, the failed attempts to reform the French state, the Estates General and the beginning of the Revolution, as well as a number of important revolutionary documents, from the Tennis Court Oath to the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. It was with the CCC that some in France began to think the revolution was overstepping its bounds. And it's with the CCC that we'll begin this presentation. Louis XVI, angered over the CCC and the diminution of his powers, decided on drastic action. In June of 1791, he and the royal family escaped from the Tuileries Palace and made for the Austrian Netherlands. The story is beautifully told by Timothy Tackett in his book, When the King Took Flight. Tackett traces the origins of the plan, the intricacies of the escape, the mistakes made by the royal entourage, and the effect the revolution had on people hundreds of miles from Paris. Louis was recognized before reaching the border and, along with his family, forced to return to Paris. To compound the problem, Louis had left a note in his office addressed to the revolution. In it, he castigated the assembly for the way it had reduced his power and prestige. The note was essentially an admittance that all of his previous, quote, support for the revolution was a lie. His attempted escape caused some in the assembly to question whether or not France really needed a king. Perhaps, they thought, France could be ruled by the assembly, and the assembly alone. However, the majority of the delegates believed that Louis was essential to the new government. After all, they had just finished creating a constitutional monarchy, which needed a monarch. It was too late now to dramatically shift gears. They had to try and repair the relationship as best they could. In 1791, elections were held under the new constitution. Due to everyone's uncertainty regarding how voting worked, only about 25% of eligible voters actually cast votes for the new Legislative Assembly. A figure who would soon play a dominant role in the revolution, Maximilien Robespierre, shamed the delegates of the National Assembly into not running for re-election. This meant all 745 delegates to the Legislative Assembly were brand new, with no experience running an entire state. Additionally, All of the reps came from the Third Estate. There was no input from the nobility or clergy this time around. The lack of experience would come into play during the first major crisis faced by the assembly. During the earlier phase of the revolution, many nobles, fearing for their privileges and not willing to give them up as some of their colleagues in Paris were, simply left. Many traveled to the Austrian Netherlands, the same location the king had tried to escape to. The assembly delegates were concerned about French nobles concocting a plan with the Austrian emperor to invade France and end the revolution. This fear led to a fateful decision: the declaration of war against Austria in April 1792. The king reluctantly supported the war. His advisors figured either one of two things would happen. Either the war would go well, and the king would gain added respect and perhaps even power within the government. Or the war would go poorly, and Austria would re-establish the monarchy with Louis XVI on the throne. Either way, the king's advisors reasoned he won. The declaration of war was more problematic for the delegates in the assembly, since many leaders of France's army had been nobles that fled the kingdom. Additionally, the French armies were woefully undersupplied and not ready to fight against another major power. Lastly, the French armies were in disarray due to the upheaval of the revolution. So France declared war without an army, without any military leaders, and without any supplies. To complicate matters even further, Austria's ally, Prussia, jumped to Austria's defense. France now faced not one, but two opponents. As you would expect, the ad hoc army France created did very poorly initially, suffering defeat after defeat. After the Austro-Prussian force took the fortress city of Verdun, the last line of defense protecting Paris, the leader of the invading force, the Duke of Brunswick, issued a manifesto promising leniency for those who did not resist the Austrians and Prussians. He also, however, promised swift retribution for any resistance encountered, including a threat to burn the city of Paris to the ground should any harm befall the king or his family. The citizens of Paris reacted with terror and anger over the military developments. Fearing what would happen if the Austro-Prussian forces made it to Paris and released all of the political prisoners, groups of radicals stormed the prisons, brought some prisoners before tribunals that confirmed their guilt, and executed them. Some didn't even get a tribunal, but were rather murdered in their own cells. The September massacres saw the deaths of roughly 1,300 people in Paris, one of the bloodiest single nights of the revolution. Even before the violence of the September massacres, the citizens of Paris made their desires clear to the assembly. In August, a large group of passive citizens, those denied the right to vote but still recruited for military service, stormed the legislative chamber, intimidating the reps into calling for yet another election to choose another legislative body. This time, however, all wealth requirements for voting were scrapped. All French men could now cast a vote. On September 22nd of 1792, the new National Convention met for the first time and abolished the monarchy, suspending the powers of Louis XVI. Let's pause here for the first review of this lesson. First, King Louis XVI, angered over the CCC and the reduction of his power, tried to escape France with his family, but was discovered and brought back to Paris. The attempt to flee caused some to believe France would be better off as a republic without a king. Second, fear of French nobles who had fled to the Austrian Netherlands led the French to declare war on Austria. but France performed very poorly in the initial stages, seeing the Austrians and their ally the Prussians capture the city of Verdun, last line of defense of Paris. Finally, the people of Paris registered their disappointment with the Legislative Assembly by storming the Convention Hall and demanding more be done to win the war. And so a new legislative body, the National Convention, was elected and abolished the monarchy. Many of the delegates to the new national legislature were tied to the radical left-wing Jacobin Club. A quick note about the use of left and right when talking about politics. Those terms, still used today, emerged during the Revolution. Those representatives who were more radical and wanted more change more quickly usually sat to the left of the speaker's podium, hence the term left-wing. Those reps who were more conservative and wanted to slow or even stop the pace of change sat to the speaker's right, hence the term right-wing. Today, therefore, people on the left tend to be more politically liberal, while those on the right tend to be more conservative. The delegates to the National Convention, therefore, tended to be quite radical and desired more changes to more aspects of French life. The convention found itself in a dire situation, however. It needed to create a new constitution, run the government in the meantime, and fight a war against two, and soon more, opponents. A rift was created among the delegates over the fate of the king. It was clear the king was guilty of treason. The debate was over what punishment he should receive. The more moderate faction, the Girondins, named after a French province called the Gironde, wanted the king either imprisoned or exiled. The more radical Mountain, so called because they occupied the highest seats in the convention hall, demanded execution. In a very close vote, it was decided that the king should die. In January 1793, Louis XVI was beheaded. This was a crucial moment for the revolution, for after you execute a king, there isn't anyone in the land you can't execute. The radicals in Paris, meanwhile, were not done influencing political events. On June 2nd of 1793, they once again stormed the convention hall. This time, they demanded the arrest of those Girondin members who called for anything less than the execution of the king. 29 delegates were arrested, and those remaining simply stopped attending meetings, leaving the convention in the hands of the most extreme, most radical members. Increasingly, day-to-day activities were being handled by the 12-man Committee of Public Safety. Maximilien Robespierre, whom we met earlier, was elected as a member of that committee and quickly became the voice of the revolution. Although Robespierre was a supporter of democracy, as the leader of the Committee of Public Safety, he helped enact a number of anti-democratic moves, always justifying his actions by arguing that France was in an emergency, and so required extraordinary measures. Some of Robespierre's thoughts, however, seemed quite contradictory. For example, he argued that in order to protect the liberty of the people, an absolute dictatorship was required. Apparently, after the emergency had passed, those liberties could be restored and everyone could enjoy them again. Perhaps the most destructive precedent Robespierre and other revolutionaries set was the identification of enemies as a means of uniting the people. Talk of counter-revolutionaries abounded, and conspiracy theorists, like the newspaper publisher and National Convention delegate Jean-Paul Marat, constantly played up how the work of the revolution was being undermined from within by domestic enemies hell-bent on ending freedom. Seeing counter-revolutionaries everywhere, in 1793, the convention launched its most ambitious and dangerous program to snuff them out. Called the Terror, it consisted essentially of martial law being imposed across the nation, with many civil liberties suspended for all people. The rights of man was officially suspended. Government officials whose loyalty to the revolution was suspect were summarily removed from office. The number of executions per day began to increase. Police spies were planted in bread lines to listen for any complaints about the government. Political clubs, especially women's political clubs, were shut down. The definition of what a suspect person was broadened. Laws protecting people from arbitrary police searches at night were repealed. In other words, the convention became a tyrannical organization with a committee of public safety serving as a 12-man dictatorship. During the Reign of Terror, from 1793 into the summer of 1794, everything became political. Everyday objects were emblazoned with revolutionary themes and colors. People were expected to wear a badge made out of red, white, and blue ribbons, reflecting the new tricolor flag the revolution had adopted. Festivals became an important part of a new civic religion that emphasized reason and secularism. While the National Assembly had tried to bring the church under state control through the CCC, the National Convention tried to simply eradicate the church through the de-Christianization program. Churches were closed and converted into temples of reason. Religious iconography was destroyed. Streets with the names of saints were renamed. A new calendar was created, with the year now composed of 12 30-day months. Each month contained 3 10-day periods called decades. Sundays were officially erased. Robespierre was opposed to this program. He believed the people needed faith, but he wanted them to put their faith in secular cults, cults of reason and liberty and the Republic. The convention also moved to put education under the state's control instead of the church's. Primary schooling became free and mandatory for both boys and girls. However, as the state had no experience running a nationwide education system, there are some indications that literacy rates dropped during this period. The revolution even penetrated the language people used. French, like other languages derived from Latin, has formal versus informal words. For instance, if you were talking to someone older than you, or someone in a position of power over you, you would refer to them with the formal vous, meaning you. If you were speaking with someone younger, or someone you were familiar with, you would use the more informal tu. The revolution didn't like this distinction between formal versus informal language and outlawed it. Additionally, the revolution also did not like the use of titles like Monsieur, Madame, Mademoiselle. Titles smacked of the Ancien Régime, a time when there was no freedom. Therefore, everyone had to refer to everyone else as citoyen or citizen. The names of children also changed during this time, moving from biblical names to those associated with Rome, like Brutus and Gracchus. In addition to education, the state also took over the registration of births, deaths, and marriages from the church. The convention also made divorce legal and easy to obtain, something ended by Napoleon and not reinstituted until the late 20th century. Finally, the convention also called for equal inheritance for all children, forbidding parents from bestowing greater wealth or property on one child, usually the first, over others. It's time for another review. First, the National Convention was split between more radical delegates and those who were more moderate. Some moderate delegates were arrested, and others simply stopped attending convention meetings, after the people of Paris once again stormed the convention hall demanding change, angry at the moderates for not wanting to execute Louis XVI. Second, the Committee of Public Safety and its leading spokesman, Maximilien Robespierre, essentially became a 12-man dictatorship that began to restrict civil liberties granted earlier in the revolution as a means of protecting it from enemies both foreign and domestic. Finally, revolutionary ideas penetrated nearly every aspect of French culture and society, including the calendar, religion, and the very language French people used to address one another. Though members of the convention were overly obsessed with the notion of internal enemies, there were groups who resisted the revolution. As mentioned earlier, half of the French clergy refused to swear the oath in the CCC. People sang royalist songs, refused to wear the tricolor badge, sheltered clergy, and in the case of a young woman named Charlotte Corday, assassinated leading revolutionaries like Jean-Paul Marat. Even more worrisome were the civil wars sparking up across France, most pressingly in the western Vendée region. Here, opponents of the revolution formed a Catholic and royal army, 40,000 strong, to fight against the convention. Fighting in the Vendée was vicious, as the combat here was not against foreign foes like the Austrians or the British, but rather against fellow Frenchmen. Atrocities were committed on both sides, and the war cost anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000 lives. In late 1793, Robespierre began to lead the revolution against even erstwhile allies. He accused one former friend of being too radical, and had him and his followers rounded up and executed. When another friend, the bombastic Georges Danton, began to suggest that perhaps the violence needed to be lessened, Robespierre accused him of not being radical enough, and Danton and his followers were rounded up and executed. By summer of 1794, though, some delegates were tiring of Robespierre. The problems began with a major festival being held in Paris, the Festival of the Supreme Being. At the crucial moment of the celebration, a giant foam mountain had been constructed, and Robespierre emerged at the top of this mountain dressed in a toga, as if he now viewed himself as some sort of Greek god. Trouble continued when Robespierre gave a speech to the convention, claiming that he had a list of enemies to be executed, some of which were in that very chamber. He refused, however, to share the list when asked, which set some of the delegates on edge. Was he preparing to accuse many of them and execute them? Was he buying time to move troops into position? The next day, when Robespierre stood to speak, the other reps shouted him down. He and some followers were arrested, and after a failed suicide attempt, Robespierre was beheaded. Ironically, after Robespierre's death, the pace of executions dwindled to almost none. It was as if the only thing that could stop the executions was the execution of the one guy continuously pushing to execute people. The power of the Committee of Public Safety waned, and a 5-man executive known as the Directory essentially ruled France for the next 5 years. Political prisoners of the convention were released, and the Jacobin Club, along with many of its members, was suppressed. Much of what the terror had created was undone, in what's known as the Thermidorian reaction, because according to the revolutionary calendar, the month of Robespierre's death was called Thermidor. The wars began by the Legislative Assembly would last in various forms from 1792 until Napoleon's final defeat in 1815. The creation of the National Convention coincided with the first real victory of French armies over foreign foes. And over time, troops became more experienced. Natural leaders emerged through the ranks. And the French armies began not only pushing foreign invaders out, but taking the fight into foreign lands themselves. By 1793, France was at war with Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands. Not only did the French have superior manpower, fielding an army of at least 700,000 men most of the time, but those men were fighting for a revolution they were helping to create. In 1794, French armies moved into the Netherlands and drew up a new constitution based on that of France, essentially bringing the revolution to another land. At first, these French armies styled themselves as liberators. They believed they were freeing other people from despotism and granting them French-style liberties that they deserved. However, as the years went on, the French came to be seen less as liberators and more as occupiers. The Directory was especially keen on creating so-called sister republics out of the territories conquered by French armies. Across the Atlantic, the French Revolution had an impact on France's Caribbean colonies. Saint-Domingue, Guadeloupe, and Martinique, though small, were very economically valuable to France. Saint-Domingue, the western half of the island of Hispaniola, was home to 465,000 enslaved people, 28,000 free blacks, and 30,000 whites. In 1791, a revolt threatened to overthrow the white overseers. The National Assembly, back in Paris, reacted by granting increased rights to the free blacks living on the island, hoping to co-opt them into helping put down the revolt. This action, however, angered the whites on the island, who 2 years later signed a treaty with Great Britain to transfer possession of Saint-Domingue to British hands. Spain, who controlled the other half of Hispaniola, sided with the British. French leaders on Saint-Domingue, needing men to defend French claims to the territory, freed all the enslaved people, and the next year the National Convention in Paris outlawed the slave trade. These steps attracted a talented black general, Toussaint Louverture, who had been fighting for Spain to try and free Saint-Domingue. Louverture switched sides and joined up with the French, successfully defending Saint-Domingue from both the British and the Spanish. Louverture, though, was arrested by Napoleon in 1804 as he attempted to reclaim the territory. Despite sending an army to retake possession of Saint-Domingue, French armies were defeated, and the Republic of Haiti was born in 1804. It's time for the final review of this lesson. First, although the leaders of the revolution were overly paranoid about counter-revolutionaries, there were those who resisted the revolution, including those clergy who refused to swear the oath of loyalty to the state, as well as the people of the western Vendée region, who formed an army to fight against the revolution. Second, Robespierre's tyranny became too much for the delegates of the National Convention to stomach, as he began denouncing and executing his friends and allies, and portrayed himself as a Greek god in an important civic festival. Robespierre's execution began the process of undoing the terror and replacing the Committee of Public Safety with the Directory government. Finally, the wars begun by the revolution would not cease until Napoleon's final defeat in 1815, and during the revolution, French armies were on the march, conquering territory and reorganizing the map of Europe. The fighting even spilled outside of Europe, as France's wealthy Caribbean colony Saint-Domingue rebelled against French rule, fighting off the British, Spanish, and Napoleon to become the independent nation of Haiti in 1804. That does it for our look at the French Revolution's radical phase. In this lesson, we examined the king's attempted escape from France and the effect that had on the revolution, the election of the Legislative Assembly, the declaration of war against Austria and the consequences of that declaration, the September massacres, the election of the National Convention, Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, changes made to French culture, and the wars against both external and internal opponents of the revolution. If you have any questions about this presentation, please leave them in the comment section below or email me if you're one of my current students. If you'd like to do some additional reading on the revolution, here are some books you can check out to get started. Finally, please act responsibly in the comment section, as only you can prevent flame wars. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I hope to see you all again in the next video.